a través de la posguerra en Estados Unidos y Europa. Entonces, ante esto, la conferencia que va a dictar el doctor Scherrer, pues desde luego nos va a ilustrar mucho al respecto. Va a ser en inglés y desde luego antes de que inicie el doctor Scherrer, le pediría al moderador de esta conferencia y gestor de la misma, el doctor Javier Becerril García, que haga la presentación de los datos curriculares del doctor Scherrer. Doctor Becerril, si es usted tan amable.
Muchísimas gracias. Y con respecto a mi colega, el profesor Christoph, I will change in English. Most of our students have to learn English. Another language would be very nice to use because possibly you have to see and face a big challenge. Also for the profession, if you are a young economist, business, international trade students, and also from the political country I have the pleasure to present Origin Population. He is a professor, Christoph, he's an economist from the University of Frankfurt, and he was the director of the National Public Political University of China. Now he represents the country, and he is me, I am a cousin university. He's a British collaborator from the training. The first this is a very kind introduction and very well Professor Christoph and really take time and prepare this interesting topic. So please welcome Professor Christoph many thanks. Thank you. Very well.
Well, thank you very much for this welcome and nice introduction. I'm pretty here from Berlin. Yesterday we had -11 degrees, but now it's a little bit warmer and the snow is melting away. Well, let's see what is happening to the US dollar. I suppose most of you are very familiar what the BRICS are. The core countries are China, Russia, India, South Africa, and Brazil. And in recent years, a few other countries joined, but the original ones are still the powerful ones within the group. So, the dollar has been criticized for its role in the global economy has been criticized for a long time. Also, some other features going along with the position of the dollar, like flexible exchange rates, which are not always good for importers and exporters, the liberal capital some countries that suffer from quick removals, and of course the IMF conditionality. Mexico was one of the first countries to develop these conditionalities in the early 1980s. Now, in 2023, the president of Brazil, Lula, at an annual conference of these countries, the BRICS countries, was advocating the creation of a currency whose representative our businesses out having to buy the dollar. And here you have to know that when countries or businesses from countries are exchanging goods, then it usually goes through the dollar. So they may have and yen, but first they exchange this into dollars and then later the dollars into yen. So there is usually not a direct exchange between the two currencies that are involved in business relations. Now, let's look a little bit into the history, because there have been a couple of attempts to have a different kind of global monetary system. And especially in the last year of the World War II, the Second World War, at Bretton Woods, the British and the Americans came together, and a couple of other countries, so it was basically the two to discuss the future, the post-war future of the monetary system. And famous economists from the UK proposed artificial currency, global monetary transactions called the bankroll. But it was quite clear that the US was in a very strong position. Great Britain had become a better country towards the United States, and the US wanted to make use of its dollars. And so the compromise was then to have a fixed exchange rate system circulating around the dollar that was then fixed to an ounce of gold for $35. So the United States promised that whenever a central bank, not a person or a company, a central bank wants to exchange its dollars into gold, they can do that with this exchange rate of $35 per ounce of gold. But a fixed exchange rate system requires a lot of political will. One example is my own country. They joined the system in the 50s, and at that time, the productivity of German companies was rather low because it was still reconstructing from the war. And so the exchange rate was 4.20 to 1. 10 years of the 50s, Germany really caught up quite quickly, and the productivity became much closer to the US level. But for a long time, the exchange rate did not move. It's a little bit from 4.20 to 4.0, but that was really not reflecting the productivity differential between the two countries. So Germany profited a lot from that fixed rate exchange regime and its own parity. And that's one of the factors of the economic wonders of Germany in the post-war period. However, then on the US side, the US then started to finance its war in Vietnam with debt and not with taxes. And as the productivity did not increase faster than the others, things had changed. And that would have been a moment where either the US would have to scale back its war efforts, or Japan and Germany especially would have to reevaluate their currencies. Yeah. So a fixed rate exchange regime is the issue of political will and finding certain compromises when economic conditions change. But that didn't really happen sufficiently. And so there was then in the early 70s a run of the dollar because the ones who were holding dollars were very afraid of higher inflation in the United States. And then Nixon decided, President Nixon was the president at the time in the US, to discontinue this commitment of exchanging US dollars for gold for $35. That is called the closing of the gold window. At that time, people, again, more from Keynesian economic perspectives, were calling for the special drawing rights as the anchor of the international monetary affairs, in a way, in line Bangkok, but that did not fly with the United States at the time, and also Germany was often very much in support of it. And so what we have seen then is flexible exchange rates. Milton Friedman was a big supporter of that change. And that led to a depreciation of the US dollar, but actually it also led to greater use of the US dollar. And that's the interesting phenomenon. So the flexible exchange rate then required exporters and importers to hedge against the volatility of the exchange rates. So that's the moment when options and derivatives really started to be very important tools. And they were running on dollars there. So the currency trade got a huge boost through the switch towards flexible exchange rates there. And the IMF was no longer tasked to organize the political meetings of fixing exchange rates. They got a new task, and that was the enforcement of debt obligations. And Mexico was one of the first countries to get to know that. So this switch, in a way, where we thought that perhaps if the dollar is no longer and the medium within the fixed exchange rate system of preeminence, that the dollar would lose preeminence overall. But that did not happen. The US, then under this regime of flexible exchange rates, proved to be able to borrow at an extremely high level. And nevertheless, the dollar still remains in the middle of financial transactions. So how can a country become such a borrower there? And that is related to the privilege the US has that it is borrowing its own currency. And not so many countries can do so there. And there are certain requirements that have to be met if a country is able to really borrow on a big scale without running into trouble. And this has to do with its economic powers, of course, also the military dimension. But of course, the very key is also to have a developed capital market with high liquidity. Liquidity is in a way a key word, meaning that those who are holding dollars can always find someone who wants them and can exchange them, or other investment vehicles. And can always go to a marketplace and exchange your asset, your financial asset, against another financial asset or kind of money. And then the overall strength of the courts in enforcing the creditors' rights so it's also quite important. Perhaps some of you still remember the incident where the US court ordered an Argentinian maritime ship in Ghana that was anchoring in Ghana to be impounded for the hedge fund. That shows you the strength of US courts to support creditors. Now, the next event that could have led to the dethroning of the dollar was the Asian currency crisis in the late 1990s. And here a lot of academics, but also practitioners in finance, were starting to criticize the way the IMF had handled its conditionalities actually was aggravating the crisis for the countries. And so the countries themselves then also started to look for alternatives to the IMF. And you have to know that the IMF, the US is the dominant force and has a veto power that together with a few others in Europe. And two avenues were pursued. It's called self-insurance. And self-insurance means that the country tries to accumulate a lot of foreign currency reserves there in order to be able to defend itself against the speculator attacking their currency. In the Asian crisis, almost all the Asian countries were attacked, not Japan, of course, but also Hong Kong was attacked. Hong Kong had a huge fire from reserves.
Recording in progress.
And was in the end able to defend its currency, the Hong Kong dollar, against the speculators. But other countries, especially Indonesia and Thailand, were not able to do so. So what happens is that nowadays many countries have built up these reserves and trying to finance at least 3 months of imports. So self-insurance, as all insurance, is coming to cost because you buy mainly US treasuries or you buy gold that doesn't have dividends, doesn't pay interest, and the US treasuries are also paying a little interest there. And instead of using your money to buy goods to support your population, you put this money into this insurance. The other strategy that was very much pursued by China was to change the IMF to more stay within the IMF, and therefore then having the IMF changing some of its policies. But the US made use of its veto power with the Europeans, and so the reform of the IMF was extremely slow, and in the end, the shares and the voting power of China and some of the other BRICS countries moved only a little bit. Not enough to dethrone the influence of the United States, the European Union, and then in 2007, 2008, 2009, we had the financial crisis emanating from the capitalist citadel of the United States. And so we would have expected that if a very deep financial crisis happened in the United States, that the dollar would lose its attractiveness. So what you notice that just the opposite occurred. The wealth of the world moved their money into the dollar. So the dollars were flowing into the United States at the time, showing that those who had money were trusting more the United States than their own government in that respect. In the United States, then also played the role of the lender of last resort. They then supported the swap lines to the central banks of other countries. And here I have a list of the countries who have this very easy access to US dollars through the swap lines. Now, to be interesting, the two countries that I mentioned here, Chile and India, were not part of that. And the key reason was that the US was not happy with their controls of monetary flows. Both countries had capital controls, and therefore the US was leading them on the swap lines. Swap lines are nowadays only permanently with the key central banks of the world, with the US, ECB, UK, Swiss, and Japan. Now, as I started out with calling for alternative to the dollar, what has happened from 2023 to 2025? Well, what happened is that in the Rio de Janeiro declaration of the BRICS last year, de-dollarization was not mentioned in that. And already in November 2024, Putin was saying we are not comfortable to abandon the US dollar and we are not seeking to do so. At the very early moment of the Russian attack on Ukraine and the sanctions that followed, there was some interest in Russia of perhaps moving beyond the dollar. But that was gone after a few years. The South African ambassador was also saying that we must avoid actually that suit very nice expression at the US, such as dollarization, and also the foreign minister of India was saying we have never actively targeted the US dollar. So the question then arises, what does China do? And China does a lot. With the BRICS, it has started a new development bank in a way that was intended to replace for the adjoining countries the IMF. So, as the IMF was not really willing to reform and to give greater weight to China and others, then they started their own bank. But so far, they have never acted as the IMF has done. They have not acted in a balanced payment process. They have acted more like the World Bank, giving loans for specific projects, but not in a situation of balance of payment crisis. And quite interestingly, the loans are there. Then they have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is really nearly a Chinese endeavor, while the New Development Bank is a BRICS endeavor with, of course, major aid from the Chinese. But the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is really dominated by the Chinese and has a lot of other members, also Germany. But the US was not very happy about it and stayed out and even put some pressure on Germany not to join. But Germany also, its export industries were quite interested in accessing some of the loans and being part of consortia of building some stuff. And then, not exclusively, but mostly, the loans are in US dollars. Then, the People's Republic of China's central bank is imitating what the Fed is doing in the United States. It has started also with swap lines with other central banks in that. And here, the Chinese have also supported countries, and especially countries where it was about their own, meaning Chinese state enterprises with swap lines. So, but it was not a BRICS effort, it was a Chinese effort, the swap lines. And China has become a major creditor around the world. And some of those debtor countries are also in difficulties. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, most payment transactions between different countries outside the United States are going through the dollar, and they are also going through a system whose headquarters is in Europe and Belgium, but whose main corresponding banks are also in the United States, and the main currency of transaction is the US dollar. So it's a system that is very much in the dollar orbit, and it's called the SWIFT. And the SWIFT, that's the infrastructure for payments between everyone crossing borders. And the Chinese started to replicate that. And they did not, nevertheless, with SWIFT. And SWIFT is still in a way the provider of the main infrastructure. So 90% of the participants in the Chinese cross-border interbank payment systems are sending their messages concerning the financial transaction through SWIFT. So even here you still see the dollar as a key currency in use. Now, the comparison also with banks. So if you look at the new development bank, not only is it not really performing like they mentioned in terms of payment processes, but it is also a bit smaller there, and also in terms of staff and the intellectual firepower, because the IMF is not just an organization of jumping in if a country has a problem with the balance of payment, but it will also give a lot of advice in there. And the Asian infrastructure bank, if you compare to the World Bank, you can also see that it is a lot smaller and also has a lot of less staff. But the swaps are also just a fraction of what the Fed does. So here we have the renminbi, RMB, standing for the Chinese currency, share as international payments currency. And you see it is in 6th place. However, over time it has changed a bit, and you see this with this graph there, that in 2024, its percentage points were up to the maximum of 4.74. So it was at that time really seen on the upswing, but then it kind of looks a little bit like there's a coincidence with the election of Donald Trump for president in the United States that has changed. And it is now basically half of what it was in 2024. And it also moved from 4th place to the 6th place. So here we can have some further data on dollar dominance. Well, of course, the dollar is no longer as dominant as it used to be in the immediate post-war period, as you can see in the graph there. The black one is the share of the dollar in reserves there. And then the blue line is a little bit a composite index trying to measure the role of US export shares in relationship to global GDP. And you see that, of course, the importance of US trade for global GDP was going down a lot. And with it, then, of course, also the reserve currency, but not as much. And it's still quite high, at almost 60% in 2024. And in cross-border lending, about half still. In the turnover, as I mentioned, the US dollar is always used in between two currencies. It is extremely dominant. And also for issuing loans, debt security, the issuances were also much in dollars, 60% in dollars in 2024. Yeah. So, what is to be expected? And to look into the future is always a little bit difficult. And one way is to make use of theory. And because quite famous economist, or he was the network effect, meaning that the currency that is much used is then also very useful for others. As I already mentioned, the word liquidity, that leads to liquidity, meaning that it is very easy to find a partner who doesn't have to go alone. So there's the great network effect. Just like with the telephone, the people are in the telephone network, the more useful it is for each individual within the network. And he also pointed out to path dependency. Most of you who are familiar with the keyboard, I believe everyone is. The keyboard, as it is currently configured, is actually not the most effective way of organizing the letters on the keyboard. It is the result of the earlier times when writing too fast was leading to cluttering of the metal, so the typewriter couldn't work. So the typewriter had to be slowed down by not so efficient configurations of the letters on the keyboard. And but as many learn, there is even a case when it is no longer so efficient and there are alternatives, people then tend to keep something that is not so efficient because of the cost of moving to a new system. So that's a bit the path dependency. So the cost of moving them to the system beyond the dollar is probably quite high. So it needs a lot of collective action, mutual will, to make it happen. So that's the path dependency argument. From an actor-centered perspective, kind of running from political science, one could see that, of course, US finance capital has a great interest because they're sitting on it there, and they're still very, very important players overall internationally. And then the state, of course, also has great interest. It allows the state to refinance itself very easily. A little anecdote from the early 1980s. President Ronald Reagan, his treasury had almost the same name, Reagan. And Reagan made a very small little change. But that was an important change. Because previously, when you bought treasury bonds, you had to take your name and put it in writing that you were now the owner of a treasury bond. And you bought them. And that led to Miami becoming much more attractive as a banking place. A lot of rich people around the world thought, oh, now it's a nice way to buy US treasuries. You no longer have to put down the name. So the US was strongly interested in keeping the dollar as a key currency there. And someone was doing a calculation and was saying that the US budget would save $140 billion in interest because of their privilege of having the world's currency. Another theory, economic stability, from Charles Kindleberger, also quite famous economist, political economist there, and he was saying that world economic trade needs someone to provide the public good. And he was a bit of a fan of the United States. He was saying that the United States was the kind to provide this public good, the US dollar. But once the hegemon is in decline, then problems arise there. And, but then other people, Nye and so on from Harvard, were saying, well, it's of interest of the newcomers to keep that public good, then they will also contribute to the public good and try to stabilize it. And so people in the alliance, they support that. In a way, that's how it worked for a long time, and that has be certain. So from a hegemonic stability theory, it is not clear whether the US dollar will keep its right role. Now, the post-structuralism, I cannot go too much into that theory, but it tells us that there is a layer of identity there, and that one can organize a collective by then demarcating an enemy there, and a common exterior there. That would say that even if there are conflicts between an alliance, if they have a common foe, then they would stick together. And one could say that under the Biden administration and so on, things like that worked a little bit. One had a bit of an alliance against Russia and China in the so-called Western world. Yeah. But I'm coming to the Fisher in the one of the next slides there. And then hegemonic cycle theory saying that if we look back, we have seen the development of capitalism, certain places to assume that role of a hegemon, like Genoa and the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, and so on, and that there are endogenous factors that lead to a decline of the hegemon. But when you look at the British, one could see they were enjoying two sides. And one cannot rule out that perhaps the US is also enjoying two sides. So there's a little bit of openness into the future will bring us. Now, when we look more closely at the most likely alternative nowadays, the world system around the rising sun in the east, the Chinese, we would see that its own model so far is a central obstacle to really make the renminbi, or yuan, also called the global currency. Because China is giving priority to production over the free flow of capital. So it still has capital controls. It had a bad experience about 10 years ago. The rich in China behaved like rich people in other countries. And once it was possible, they tried portfolio strategy, risk deduction. be there. So there is still a primacy of politics in China, and that is very sovereignty. There is great concern in China about sovereignty on the background of having lost that to a certain degree in the late 19th century and then into the 20th century with the Japanese occupation and so on. And, perhaps a heavy hand of Stalin in the post-war period and the struggle of the US and so on. So they give this primacy to politics and a little political independence, and that always risks for that implies risk for the asset holders there. So they rather like systems where they have less political measuring into the affairs. So to make the renminbi as the key currency in the world would require a major change in the economic model of the Chinese. And for a certain time, the Hong Kong played a special role within the Chinese orbit, greater liberty for finance and so on. And that has been reduced now too, as a few years ago, the Chinese government stopped the democracy movement in Hong Kong. So when we look at the future monetary regime, we see that flexible exchange rates will probably stay. The free movement of capital will stay, and the IMF will remain as a key player. However, things have changed a little bit from the heydays of neoliberalism. Many economics are also tolerated. The currency pegs are tolerated to a certain degree that a country can peg its own currency to another country unilaterally. And of course, official dollarization like in Zimbabwe or Ecuador and so on. And capital controls to a certain degree at a lower level have also gotten directly supported by the IMF nowadays. So there is no longer two rigid ideas of the liberal markets. So the Chinese ideas are not completely out of line. So they are more radical in a way, they have more control than what is in the overall system, but the overall system is completely different. But what is the vision actually of the People's Republic? And here we see them, to go back to Keynes, the artificial currency, that without the US dollar and the US as a consumer of last resort, it would also be difficult, to keep its economic model that relies on a huge current surplus there. And if it wants to keep its control of its own exchange rate there, and it actually has become a creditor, it also doesn't have interest in other countries that have capital controls. That's interesting, that it doesn't really push other countries to support its capital controls policies. It's just the other way around. And as creditor behavior becomes ever more similar to the creditor behaviors of the old capitalist countries. It started out with much less demands and freedom for the countries to take loans, but it already has certain clauses in its agreements. So, for example, if countries will change their environmental labor policies, then the Chinese reserve the right to step back. And I'm not sure whether you are familiar with what is a Paris club. For creditors, two clubs. The London club, that is the private creditors, and the Paris club is for the stock creditors, and these are then the meetings with the debtors. So the Paris club is where stockholders and creditors are meeting the debtors and negotiating the terms. And the Chinese said, no, we are not doing that, we are not like the old imperialist countries dictating that. But as more and more debtors to China also have troubles to repayment, I believe over time Chinese will also like to hide behind debt or hide behind others. And we have already seen that in the restructuring of Ghana Blue, China then coordinated the Paris Club. So since in that way they are also moving into the mainstream. So the Chinese alternatives cannot be easily rationalized, I would say, like Friedrich Nietzsche, the main author of economic nationalism, who was not against capitalism, but was very much about catching up with UK at the time. China was a special right within the common system in order to act just as cosmopolitans as this has called the ones who have already utilized them capitalists. So the Chinese are not really having a model, just specific deviations, and that's why I would say it cannot be easily generalized for capitalist world economy. I would say that owners of capital always try to protect their properties from too much greedy intervention. But I would practically work on my last sentence, and that has something to do with one of my last slides there. That the future is not really predictable, and we do have now the Trump factor. And there are already about the US deficit. And I have here a graph where you see on the one hand that the interest payments were like 3% of American GDP, and they're projected to go to 4%. And some people say, well, that's so very problematic. I personally don't see that it's so problematic to go from 3 to 4%. But then others are saying there's also lost institutional credibility, because the credibility of securing the interest of the money was, of course, one of the factors that led wealthy people around the world to move into the dollar. And just yesterday, we see the next attack by Trump on the US central bank Fed. So people are also worried that if the institutional credibility is lost, then also the strength of the dollar will become weaker. And we have seen that in commodity trade, the dollar has lost some of its shine. We have seen that especially Russia and China, because of sanctions, India, Russia, China, and Brazil, and so on, have started to then have agreements where they don't go with the dollar in their payments. However, we also see something new coming along, and there are stablecoins. And stablecoins are used a lot in different countries where people are not trusting their own government. Very well in Venezuela, but also in Nigeria, the people are now moving money out of the country with the help And the stablecoins are backed by the US dollar. So even the alternative, the US dollar moving money from one country to another country, is relying on the US dollar. So I'm not so sure that actually leads to a deflowing of the US dollar. And then that might then explain why the BRICS last year did not call for the de-dollarization. Trump was quite clear. I told them, the BRICS, if they want to play games with the dollar, then they are going to be with 100% tariff for that. And too many of the BRICS countries are still entitled with the US or the allies still coming out of the US. And we have also seen now policies of building a new zone of sphere of influence, of trying to reconquer the Americas from the Arctic to the Antarctic, the first step of the administration. So, I would say that in the short run, the dollar will raise green, but nevertheless, the future is open. We'll have to see how it all plays out and whether these new, very aggressive policies will end in major war. Thanks for listening.
Huge flows. Thanks. I like to support me by myself. You have been collecting some questions from the John. Thanks.
Para las preguntas, doctor si en alguno de tus compañeros la hacen en español, usted podría ser tan amable de hacer la traducción.
Profesor, también sí me escucha.
Sí, también.
Sí, okay. Christoph, well, first of all, most appreciate your time and sharing that valuable, this valuable information to share with us. I was just wondering, considering the atmosphere was happening currently with the politics and what we just saw, weeks ago, what happened in so I was wondering, what could be the implications of, the U.S. government starting to do this, like for example, they're now planning to essentially to take leave us, right? So what could be the implications for the Latin American countries, not only for Mexico, but especially the dollarized countries like El Salvador, Ecuador, and Canada, because currency, officially currency now is the US dollar. What could be the implications and consequences in the short term for these countries? Thank you.
Well, it's a very pertinent question, but not so easy to answer. When we look at previous strategies of US presidents in dealing with the challenge that the rise of China poses to US dominance, we have seen with that try to have a Pacific free trade zone and certainly China, and combining that with a free trade zone in the Atlantic. We need to have a system of trade very much in line with the interests of US corporations, and thereby then challenging China to enter this free trade zone. And by entering it, it would have for strong way to open up more. And this strategy failed in the US because Trump got into power and he thought he could directly face the Chinese with tariffs. That strategy also didn't work. And then Biden came to power, and his strategy was in a way a combination of both. He tried to reassemble, in a way, a coalition of allies facing China, and at the same time keeping down with tariffs and then supporting the US industry. And in the end, that also didn't slow down China. 4 years were also too little. And Trump now is back. And it seems that Trump's strategy is now not only to face China with tariffs, but also to build a very strong base of the United States within the Americans, and to marshal the resources of the Americans, really from the Arctic. He is also not just talking about Greenland, but he's also talking about Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. Yeah, that would also be dollarized, of course, not the Canadian dollar anymore. And then, as we have seen now, the pressure on the Israeli oil, which certainly then also will lead to pressure on Cuba and Nicaragua and other countries that have come that were not so friendly towards the United States. So it's a strategy of getting back control over the zone of influence and facing then China. And for us in Europe, it's also very interesting because the Greenland grab is directly against Europe because it's still European territory, it's a Danish territory. And here it is clear that the Trump administration wants to weaken Europe. It wants to do away with the European Union as a challenger. And at the same time, it also wants to have better access to the energy resources of Russia. And therefore, it's this very strange policy of engaging with Russia. So what you see in a way is preparation, long-term preparation for a major challenge, not in just the economic way, but also in the military way, with the People's Republic of China. And Latin America is the Germans call the Hinterhof, meaning the backyard, that it's then supposed to provide the resources to do so. My great-grandfather had a factory in Monterey until the wonderful revolution. And he was saying that the fate of Mexico is that it is too far away from God and too close to the United States. And it seems to me that that still holds true, unfortunately.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much for the next question. Preguntas aquí.
Good morning, Mr. Scherrer. I have a question regarding the Chinese initiatives that you showed, mostly in the Medium Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You showed some information that it shows that those initiatives have been performing very well, even though they have less than 10% of the same ways that the IMF has. Do you think that we'll be able to achieve the plan of replacing the IMF with the balance and the debt paying? Thank you.
May I ask to repeat the question on the IMF, because there was an echo in the hall. That was difficult. So just the key sentence on the IMF, you want to know something about the IMF.
Yeah, I want to see, do you think that the ending mandate will be able to replace the IMF and balance of payments, right? Even though that's the plan that you told us about.
The IMF will remain in a key position. However, as the Chinese capital has become so prominent, I suppose that there will be also more coordination between the Chinese and the IMF in dealing with debtor countries there. So I don't really think there will be a reform of the IMF under the current Trump administration, just the opposite of that. But for making sure that if a country cannot repay its debt, that not one of them, the Chinese or the creditors behind the IMF, will lose out. They will have to coordinate their dealings with the debtor country, and that could be a bit in favor of the debtor country, that there are not the two players, which of course we have in my bank, but that's some different interest that allow the debtor country to have a bit of a strong negotiation position.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Maestro Gerardo, probably the last was there and 4 p.m. Well, very the last question. Right?
Hi, hello. First of all, good evening. I don't know if you were there, but my first question is if the US were facing some conundrums into the government, were there any possibility to use another coin that were the US dollar? Mostly because, as you said, the countries that are aligned to the BRICS are not really thinking I'm not really thinking to compete with the US dollar. Or if there were some conundrum to the government, there will be another coin.
Repeated question because there is always a difference. It's significant for me to read the question.
Yeah, the profesor said que hay algo de eco en el salón. Si te puedes acercar más y tapar tu micrófono con tu boca, con tu mano.
Okay, so the question is if the US government were facing some conundrums into, well, the interior of their government, were there any possibility to use another coin that were the US dollar? Mostly because you said that the countries that are into the BRICS are not going or they are not seeking to replace the dollar window, but there is another money or another a coin from another country that could possibly, like replace the US dollar?
Well, I would expect that the BRICS countries will not go against the US dollar in the current period because of the entanglement of their industries with the US and the erratic behavior of the Trump administration. From what they do, that is probably to be a little under the radar. So they will have probably some more swap lines where they will then directly exchange their currencies for certain transactions, not overall transactions. They will not call for a general different currency, but they will try nevertheless to avoid the dollar by having these bilateral swap lines with them. That I would expect as a strategy in order to have a little bit less dependency and be a little bit less vulnerable towards US sanctions and US policies.
Thank you very much, Professor Christoph Chair. For us, it's a very prestige when you talk to all these young students and put it in their small size. They have to improve their knowledge, political economy, and world very important. Maestro, you have something to add? Take the class.
Okay. Muchas gracias a Dr. Scherrer, thank you for the very interesting conference. Con esto, con esta temática, ¿verdad? Pues de un experto que ve más la óptica desde un país europeo, desde luego que también es importante tener en cuenta. Pues estamos bien, de hecho, para la próxima semana vamos a tener otra videoconferencia con otro profesor que lo vamos a difundir, ¿verdad? Que también el doctor Scherrer ha gestionado muy amablemente, ¿verdad? Sobre otro tema de mucho interés, que parece que es bioeconomía, en un momento se les hará la difusión. Entonces, pues muchas gracias, doctor Scherrer, por todo su apoyo, la gestión de esta conferencia y desde luego su respaldo en la misma. Al doctor Scherrer, pues muchísimas gracias, ¿verdad? Y gracias a todos ustedes, con lo cual pues arrancamos, me parece de una manera muy interesante las actividades académicas en este ciclo, en este semestre. Muchas gracias por quienes se conectaron también en línea, en vivo, gracias a los profesores que amablemente nos han apoyado al respecto. Muchas gracias. Gracias, doctor. Y pues tengan excelente día.
Thanks a lot, Professor Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gracias.